On the afternoon of August 4th, 2010, the house was unnervingly quiet, the type of silence that presses down on you, making each breath feel heavier. As the officers stepped inside, their footsteps echoed through the dimly lit hallway, and it didn't take long to find the source of that stillness. The children's bodies, lifeless, pale, were sprawled across the floor of the living room, untouched by time or the world outside. Their small forms lay in an unnatural stillness, a chilling reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded only hours before. One officer paused, his hand hovering over his radio. The words came out in a whisper, thick with disbelief. "They're gone. All of them." And there, in the corner of the room, sat Teresa Riggi, staring blankly at the scene before her, her hands trembling, her eyes vacant. "I had to do it to keep them with me," she muttered, her voice cold as if the weight of the words had never crossed her mind. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and in that moment, the true horror of what had just occurred settled over the house. The stillness in the house hung in the air like a thick fog, an eerie reminder that something was terribly wrong. August 4th, 2010, in the quiet suburb of Edinburgh, was supposed to be just another day, one filled with the humdrum of suburban life. In the sleepy corners of this peaceful neighborhood, where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over fences and children's laughter echoed down the streets, tragedy was the last thing anyone expected to strike. But inside the Riggi home, the air had always been thick with tension, though few outside the house could have guessed it. Teresa Riggi appeared to most as just another mother, blending into the fabric of everyday life. She kept to herself, never raising suspicion with the community. But behind closed doors, Teresa was anything but ordinary. She was a woman, consumed by control and paranoia, a mother who viewed her children not as individuals but as possessions, extensions of her will, her very need to dominate. To her, losing them to anyone else, even in a divorce, was unthinkable. Her children, Austin and Luke, both 8, and little Cecilia, just 5, were vibrant, full of life, each with their own dreams and aspirations. Austin had a love for drawing, his room filled with sketches of imagined worlds. Luke, the more active of the twins, dreamt of becoming a footballer, his every waking moment spent outside kicking a ball. And Cecilia, with her wide eyes and unspoken wonder, had just begun to explore the world around her. To them, the world was full of endless possibilities, all taken from them in a single, cruel moment. The house, usually filled with the sounds of children's laughter and playful arguments, had fallen into a suffocating silence. Teresa stood in the kitchen, her mind clouded with a single terrifying thought. If I can't have them, no one else will. The custody battle with her estranged husband had pushed her to the edge, and now, the thought of losing control over her children consumed her completely. In a moment of fury, Teresa descended into madness. Her hand trembled as she reached for the kitchen knife, the cold steel seeming to echo in the empty room. Austin and Luke, unaware of the storm brewing, played in the living room while little Cecilia colored on the floor. But that moment, so full of innocent life, would shatter in an instant. Teresa's breath quickened as she moved toward the children, her pulse pounding in her ears. The first scream came from Austin as he felt the sharp blade dig into his small body. His eyes widened, in shock, confusion flashing across his face. "Why, Mommy?" His words never left his lips. Luke's scream followed, his twin's pain sparking a reaction from him. But Teresa was beyond reasoning now, her eyes cold, fixated on the task ahead. Cecilia's terrified cries filled the room as she tried to scramble away, but there was nowhere to run. The knife was swift, cutting through their flesh as if it were nothing. With each blow, the terror in their eyes grew, their breath slowing as they fought to understand what was happening. The house, once a place of warmth, now held only the chilling sounds of the children's final breaths. The knife moved methodically, each strike a brutal act of control and rage, a desperate attempt to hold on to her twisted vision of motherhood. Teresa paused, her breath ragged, staring down at the children she had just taken from this world. The room was eerily quiet, save for the thudding of her own heartbeat. They were mine. No one was going to take them from me, she thought, almost as if justifying the horror she had just committed. She looked at their still bodies, a twisted sense of satisfaction creeping in. But then panic surged. She couldn't undo what had been done. The guilt, the horror, it overwhelmed her. Her mind, already spiraling, began to break. With shaking hands, she stepped toward the balcony, the same cold steel in her grip. And with one last thought of her children, she jumped. But the ground did not greet her as she had hoped. Instead, it left her broken but alive. The aftermath of her actions would unfold in ways she never imagined, but in that moment there was no escape from the nightmare she had created. It wasn't long before the absence of noise drew attention. The usual chaos that surrounded the Riggi household, a house full of children's laughter, the sound of games, the hum of everyday life, had suddenly stopped. Neighbors who were accustomed to hearing the children's playful bickering and the bustling routine of family life grew concerned when all was eerily silent for days. Calls went unanswered. The Riggi family had vanished from their usual rhythm. When the police arrived, it was clear something was terribly wrong. The front door was unlocked, a sign that no one had intended to leave in a hurry. But as the officers stepped inside, the silence felt unnatural, like something was waiting to be uncovered. It wasn't until the forensic team entered the home that the full horror was realized. Teresa sat in the living room, bloodied and cold, her lifeless eyes staring into nothing. The children, once full of life, lay still on the floor, their small bodies untouched, the brutal evidence of their mother's rage visible in every corner of the room. The detectives moved cautiously through the house, their faces a mixture of disbelief and grim resolve. The weight of the scene bore heavily on them. The lifeless bodies of the children told a story far darker than anyone had anticipated. They had never seen anything like it. It was more than a murder. It was the destruction of a family, and the cold, calculating nature of the crime sent a chill through everyone present. The horror that had unfolded behind those walls would never leave them. The quiet suburban neighborhood, once so full of life, was now a place stained with grief and unspoken questions. The trial of Teresa Riggi was nothing short of a spectacle of emotional confrontation. The courtroom, filled with survivors and those seeking justice, was heavy with tension. Every glance cast at Teresa, sitting stoically in the defendant's chair, was one of disbelief. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the room, each word feeling like a hammer striking stone, the impact reverberating against the silence. "She didn't just kill her children," the prosecutor declared. "She murdered their futures, their dreams." Teresa's response was chilling. Her voice, cold and distant, lacked any trace of remorse. "They were mine," she said, her words cutting through the room. "No one was going to take them from me." The indifference in her tone only heightened the sense of horror. She spoke as though her children were mere possessions, and her right to control them had been denied. The very idea of motherhood was twisted in her mind, and she saw no fault in her actions. The families of the victims, their hearts shattered by the loss, found themselves unable to hold back. Aunt Carol, shaking with rage, stood to speak of her niece, Cecilia. "She was 5, she was a child," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her grief. This wasn't justice. This was cruelty. The courtroom was silent as she struggled to control her tears. Her words reverberated with a deep, aching pain, a reminder that no matter the verdict, nothing could ever undo the damage done to her family. Teresa remained motionless, her face a mask of indifference as the families mourned. The walls of the courtroom closed in, each statement a painful reminder of the innocence lost and the lives forever scarred by her actions. The courtroom fell, silent as the judge delivered Teresa Riggi's sentence: life in prison. There was no death penalty in Scotland, but even if there had been, it would not have brought back the children she had taken. The weight of the verdict seemed to hang in the air. But for the families, it was far from a moment of closure. No punishment could undo the brutality. No sentence could heal the gaping wounds left behind. Austin's grandmother, a frail woman who had lost her reason for living, collapsed in tears. "No sentence can bring them back," she whispered through her sobs, her voice cracking under the weight of grief that seemed impossible to bear. The family was left to grapple with the harsh truth that justice in its cold and final form would never ease the pain of the loss. Teresa, though locked away in a cold cell for the rest of her life, remained unrepentant, her twisted sense of ownership over her children never wavering. She would spend her days behind bars, but in the minds of those who survived, the real sentence had already been handed down, one of endless suffering, an irreversible loss that haunted every waking moment. The emotional toll on the family was immeasurable. They would never see the laughter of Austin, the dream-filled eyes of Luke, or the innocent wonder of Cecilia again. The scars left behind by their murder were permanent, etched deeply into the hearts of those left behind. The grief was like a shadow, always there, always lingering, something they could never escape. Between 1972 and 1985, Schenectady, New York, was plagued by a series of unexplained deaths, each one more tragic than the last. 9 children, all in their infancy or early childhood, were claimed by a mysterious force. Doctors ruled each death as sudden infant death syndrome SIDS, but the truth would reveal a far darker story. The children, Jennifer, Joseph, Barbara, Timothy, Nathan, Michael, Mary Frances, Jonathan, and Tammy Lynn, didn't die of natural causes. They were killed, suffocated by the hands of someone they trusted the most, their mother, Mary Beth Tinning. Didn't want them anymore, she would later confess, her voice cold, as if the lives she had taken were nothing more than burdens she had grown tired of carrying. Her chilling words echoed through the courtroom, and the truth finally emerged. The deaths had been no accidents. They had been murders, and Mary Beth's role as a mother was a facade behind which she hid her deep, manipulative nature. Mary Beth Tinning was an unassuming woman, fair-skinned, with medium height and brown hair, blending into suburban life as a mother. But behind closed doors, she harbored a dark, twisted need for attention and sympathy. A seemingly loving mother, Mary Beth played the part well, until her children began to die, one after another. With each child, the town mourned, the doctors puzzled over unexplained deaths, and Mary Beth mourned too. But her grief was always accompanied by an overwhelming need for others to notice her suffering. Over the span of 13 years, from 1972 to 1985, Mary Beth buried 9 children, each death initially labeled as SIDS, a tragic, unexplained phenomenon that took the lives of seemingly healthy infants. But the frequency of these deaths in one family began to raise suspicion. To those around her, Mary Beth was a grieving mother. Except no one knew the truth. Mary Beth didn't lose her children to nature. She killed them, suffocating each of them in the secrecy of her home, using various means to end their lives, all while gaining sympathy from the community that mourned her loss. Her narcissistic, manipulative behavior seemed driven by a need to control the narrative of her life. The deaths became a tool for her, a way to make others pay attention to her and her never-ending grief. The deaths in the Tinning household were not random or accidental. Each child's death was carefully orchestrated by a mother who craved attention and sympathy from the community. Mary Beth's method of murder was often the same. She suffocated her children, covering their faces or using other means to ensure they would never wake up. It was a silent, terrifying death, one that allowed her to maintain her image as a grieving mother. Her first victim, Jennifer, was only a few months old when she died. The doctors were baffled by the sudden loss, unable to explain the cause of death, but it was ruled as SIDS. Then came Joseph, Barbara, Timothy, Nathan, Michael, Mary Frances, Jonathan, and Tammy Lynn, all lost in the same way. Each death followed the same pattern. Mary Beth would become the center of attention, grieving openly, but always with a sense of self-centered sorrow. She needed the sympathy, the outpouring of support from family and friends, and she found it through the death of her children. But as the years passed, the pattern of these deaths became harder to ignore. The Tinning family's tragedy began to take on a darker hue. Mary Beth, despite her grief, seemed oddly detached from the loss. She was quick to gain the sympathy of others, always seeking validation for her suffering. But underneath that mask was a woman who, over time, began to view her children as obstacles, burdens that she was no longer willing to carry. In her own chilling words, Mary Beth later said, "They were just too much for me." And with that, she admitted to the deaths that had destroyed her family and fooled the entire town. The first few deaths in the Tinning household were ruled as tragic accidents, but as the years went by, the pattern of Sid's deaths in one family became too suspicious to ignore. Local doctors, puzzled by the frequency of these coincidences, began to look closer at the situation. Investigators eventually started to ask questions, and when Tammy Lynn, the youngest child, died in 1985, the investigation into Mary Beth's role began in earnest. Police began to retrace the history of the family's losses, noting that each death had occurred under strange circumstances. The timing, the consistency of the deaths, and the fact that Mary Beth had always been present when each child died were enough to prompt further investigation. Eventually, forensic evidence revealed the truth. The children had been murdered, suffocated by someone they trusted. As the evidence mounted, Mary Beth's cold demeanor became even more unsettling. She played the part of the grieving mother perfectly, but as the investigation deepened, her true role as the killer became undeniable. Despite her attempts to feign innocence, the truth was clear. Mary Beth Tinning had used her children's deaths as a tool for sympathy and attention, and the community's heartache was nothing more than her own sadistic game. Mary Beth's trial was a spectacle of emotional intensity. The courtroom was filled with grief-stricken family members, all of whom struggled to understand how a mother could commit such horrific acts. Mary Beth, however, remained emotionless, her expression unchanging as the prosecutor laid out the brutal details of her crimes. It wasn't about love, the prosecutor said, his voice filled with disbelief. It was about control. It was about making them feel sorry for her. She killed her children so she could be the center of attention. That was her sick game. As the prosecution detailed the suffocation of 9 children, the courtroom was heavy with emotion. Some of the victims' relatives sobbed uncontrollably, their grief palpable, while others could only sit in stunned silence, unable to process the horror of what had happened to their family. "I didn't want them anymore," Mary Beth admitted, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion one would expect from a mother confessing to such a monstrous crime. She showed no remorse, no recognition of the pain she had caused. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable as the weight of the truth finally sank in. Mary Beth had murdered her own children, and the cost of her manipulation was more than anyone could comprehend. Mary Beth Tinning was convicted of second-degree murder for the deaths of her children and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Her sentence, while harsh, could never truly undo the damage she had caused. The grief and loss her family endured was not something that could be erased with a conviction. Her conviction was the culmination of years of manipulation and tragedy, but it was far from a moment of closure for the families involved. Mary Beth's actions had robbed them of the chance to know their children, and no punishment could return the time they had lost. The Tinning family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. They had been victims of Mary Beth's twisted need for control and attention, and their grief would never end. The emotional toll on the surviving family members was impossible to measure. The loss of 9 children, each one taken before their time, left a permanent scar on everyone who had known them. Mary Beth's time in prison did little to heal the wounds she had caused. The pain of her family's loss would haunt them forever, and the truth about Mary Beth's motives remained a haunting reminder of how far she would go to feed her narcissistic desires. What drives a mother to kill her own children? Is it a twisted need for attention, or a deeper, darker pathology that makes one believe they are entitled to control life and death itself? Mary Beth Tinning's actions were born not from love, but from a destructive, narcissistic desire to make others feel sorry for her. In the end, Mary Beth didn't just lose her children, she lost her humanity. And while she sits in prison, far removed from the lives she stole, the families of her victims are left to wonder, how could a mother ever become so lost in herself that she could murder her own flesh and blood for nothing more than the pity of others? In the 1990s, the small town of Raymond, Washington, hid a dark secret behind its quiet streets. It was a place where families were supposed to be safe, But beneath the facade of normalcy, one woman's sadistic hunger for control would unravel everything. Kathy Loreno, a close family friend, was found dead, her body showing signs of brutal abuse. She wasn't the first victim, and tragically, she wouldn't be the last. As police dug deeper, they discovered that Kathy, along with Shane Watson, Shelley, Nate's nephew, and Ron Woodworth, an elderly man, had been tortured, starved, and worked to death under Shelley's cruel reign. She deserved it. They were worthless, Shelley would later say, her words flat and emotionless, as if her victims were nothing more than pawns to be discarded. But the horror wasn't just in their deaths. It was in the twisted mind of the woman who had orchestrated their suffering. Raymond, Washington, was a town where nothing was ever meant to be hidden, where families gathered for barbecues and neighbors looked out for one another. But in the home of Shelley Nate, things were far from normal. Standing tall with a strong, imposing figure, Shelley was a woman whose beauty and outward appearance masked the darkness beneath. She was manipulative and sadistic, someone who thrived on the pain and humiliation of others. Her psychological control over her family, including her own daughters, was absolute. She wasn't just a woman. She was a predator who reveled in domination. Shelley believed her victims were weak, undeserving of kindness, and owed her obedience. Her power over them wasn't just about fear. It was about reducing them to nothing. Kathy Loreno, once a trusted family friend, became one of Shelley's first victims. Shane Watson, Shelley's nephew, and Ron Woodworth, an elderly man, would follow, each falling victim to Shelley's suffocating control. They were forced to work long hours, starved, and beaten for even the slightest disobedience. Shelley's house, once a place of comfort, had become a house of torment where life was only worth living if you bowed to her demands. The horrors inside Shelley Nate's home began in small, quiet moments, unnoticed at first, but as they piled up, they became undeniable. Kathy, Shane, and Ron were subjected to grueling labor, forced to work on the property day and night with no rest. Any resistance to Shelley's control was met with cruel punishment. Beatings, starvation, and psychological torment became their lives as they were slowly broken down by a woman who saw them as mere tools for her amusement. Shane, young and full of potential, was nothing but an obstacle in Shelley's eyes. "I just wanted to make them obey me," Shelley later said, as if obedience could justify the brutality she inflicted. Kathy, who once trusted Shelley, had fallen victim to the same fate. Her body withered from starvation, her spirit crushed by the constant abuse. Ron, elderly and frail, stood no chance. Shelley's sadistic joy in breaking him down was evident. Each day brought new levels of torment. They were forced to work tirelessly, deprived of food, and punished for even the slightest mistake. Their bodies grew weaker, but Shelley's thirst for power remained unquenched. She saw them as objects, mere pawns in her twisted game of control. The final blow came when the victims were no longer capable of surviving the brutality. Shelley's husband, under her command, disposed of the bodies, hiding the traces of their suffering, but the evil that had permeated their lives could never be erased. Shelley's control over her victims ended only in death, and her need for power remained unchecked. The disappearance of Kathy Loreno, Shane Watson, and Ron Woodworth went unnoticed for too long. In a small town like Raymond, it was easy for such things to slip under the radar, but as time passed, questions began to surface. Neighbors grew suspicious of the strange quietness surrounding Shelley's home and the sudden absence of those who had once been a part of the local community. It wasn't until a tip from a concerned acquaintance led the police to Shelley's house that the full extent of the horrors began to emerge. The authorities discovered disturbing evidence: broken furniture, chains, and remnants of the hard labor her victims had been forced to endure. But it wasn't until they uncovered the bodies, buried secretly under the guise of normality, that the truth became undeniable. When Shelley's husband was arrested, he revealed the gruesome details. He had disposed of the bodies at Shelley's command, his complicity a result of his own fear and manipulation. Shelley, however, remained cold and unrepentant, showing no remorse for the lives she had stolen. The town of Raymond was shaken to its core. The horrifying realization that such cruelty had been carried out in their midst, hidden behind a mask of normalcy, left the community reeling. The trust once shared between neighbors was shattered, and the victims' families were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The trial of Shelley Nate was a brutal confrontation between the cold, calculated actions of a woman devoid of remorse and the families of her victims, whose lives had been irrevocably shattered. In the courtroom, Shelley was a stark contrast to the emotional outburst that surrounded her. Her tall, imposing figure sat unmoved as the evidence of her cruelty was laid bare. Her cold, emotionless demeanor only heightened the horror of her actions. They deserved it. They were worthless, Shelley declared during her testimony. Her voice flat, her eyes devoid of any empathy. The chilling lack of remorse in her words sent waves of shock through the courtroom as the families of her victims struggled to hold back their anger and heartbreak. Ron's daughter, breaking down in the witness stand, spoke of her father's final days. "My father was a kind man," she cried. "How could she do this to him?" The grief in her voice echoed in the room, a painful reminder that Shelley's actions had robbed not just her victims, but their loved ones of a future they had once dreamed of. As the prosecution laid out Shelley's long history of manipulation and sadism, the courtroom grew heavy with the weight of the tragedy. Shelley's silence only deepened the emotional toll on the victims' families, who were left to reckon with the brutal truth of the crime. When the judge pronounced the sentence, life in prison without parole, it felt like a hollow victory. Shelley Nate, the woman who had preyed upon her family and her friends, would never walk free again. But for the families of the victims, the sentence could never undo the damage she had caused. Kathy's family, Shane's parents, and Ron's children were left to navigate a world without their loved ones, a world forever scarred by the cruelty of one woman's desire for control. "No sentence will ever bring them back," Kathy's sister said, tears streaming down her face. "We're left with nothing but the emptiness of knowing what she did to them." In prison, Shelley's fate was sealed, but her twisted need for control didn't end with her incarceration. She remained defiant, continuing to manipulate those around her, refusing to show any remorse for the lives she had destroyed. Her sadistic tendencies were not confined to her victims. They lived on in the way she carried herself, even behind bars. The emotional toll on the victims' families was immeasurable. They would never see their loved ones again, and the grief, much like the power Shelley had over her victims, lingered. It was a darkness they would carry for the rest of their lives. What makes a person capable of such evil? Was it simply a hunger for control, or something more insidious? A sickness that twisted her mind and turned her loved ones into nothing more than tools for her amusement. Shelley Nate's actions went beyond simple cruelty. They were a manifestation of a deep, consuming desire to dominate, to break the spirit of those around her. In the end, Shelley Nate didn't just take lives. She took the future of a family, the hope of those who had trusted her, and the peace of a small town that would never be the same. And as she sat alone in her prison cell, one question remained. What kind of person does it take to destroy everything they once claimed to love? November 2001, Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. A crisp, quiet evening shattered by a gunshot. Rob Andrew, a man who never saw it coming, was murdered in his own garage, his life snuffed out in an instant. The crime unfolded just feet away from where his children played, the sounds of their laughter eerily juxtaposed with the deafening violence that stole their father's life. When the police arrived, they found Rob's body, but there was something worse. Brenda Andrew, his wife, was already gone. She had fled with their children, vanishing into the night, the stench of betrayal hanging heavy in the air. "I did it for the money. It was the only way out," Brenda would later confess, her words cold, as if the life of the man she had once promised to love meant nothing more than an obstacle. This was no ordinary crime. It was a calculated act of manipulation and greed, one that would change everything for those involved. Oklahoma City, once a peaceful suburban landscape, became the scene of a brutal betrayal on the night of November 2001. Brenda Andrew, tall, blonde, and always impeccably dressed, had played the part of the loving wife for years. But beneath her outward charm was a woman driven by a deep thirst for money and control. To her, Rob Andrew had become a burden, no longer the man she needed, but an obstacle standing in the way of her desire for freedom and financial gain. Brenda, a woman skilled in the art of manipulation, had found a lover in James Pavitt, a man who shared her thirst for money and an easy life. Together, they devised a plan to kill Rob, using his life insurance policy as the means to escape their shared burdens. Rob, unaware of his wife's betrayal, continued with his life as normal, never suspecting that the woman he loved was plotting his murder. Their children, blissfully unaware of the growing storm, played nearby as their father's life came to a brutal end, taken in cold blood by the one person who should have protected him. For Brenda, the moment she orchestrated Rob's death was just the beginning of her escape. The night Rob Andrew was murdered began like any other. He returned home from work, greeted by his children and the familiar comfort of his home. But the facade of domestic peace was shattered the moment he stepped into his garage. Brenda, waiting with her lover James Pavitt, had already set the stage. Without warning, Rob was confronted, the sound of a gunshot ringing out echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Rob's body crumpled to the ground, blood pooling around him, while his children, mere feet away, were left to wonder what had just happened to their father. Brenda stood there, a silent participant in the horror she had orchestrated. James Pavitt, the trigger man, had done the job with cold precision, but it was Brenda who had set it all in motion. She had manipulated him, just as she had done with Rob, using her sexuality and promises of a life free from constraints to convince him to carry out the murder. The money from Rob's life insurance policy was to be the reward for their crime, but Brenda's motives ran deeper. She wanted to free herself from a life that had no place for the kind of control and wealth she craved. Once Rob lay dead, Brenda showed no sign of remorse. Instead, she fled with her children to Mexico, escaping the aftermath of her actions and hoping that the life she had dreamed of would finally be hers. The investigation into Rob Andrew's murder began with a simple question: who would want him dead? At first, Rob's death appeared to be a robbery gone wrong, but as detectives dug deeper, strange inconsistencies began to emerge. Rob's own wife, Brenda, had been the last to see him alive, yet she was nowhere to be found after the crime. Neighbors recalled seeing Brenda acting strangely in the days leading up to the murder. Her behavior had been erratic, her relationship with Rob strained. Witnesses also mentioned her sudden, unexplained absence the night of the killing. The cracks in her alibi grew, and soon, investigators began to piece together the true nature of the crime. Forensic evidence tied the murder to James Pavitt, and through further investigation, the connection to Brenda became undeniable. It was only after Brenda and her children were found in Mexico, having fled the country, that the full magnitude of the conspiracy came to light. Brenda's involvement was clear, and as she was extradited back to Oklahoma, the horror of her actions sank in. The community was left in shock, unable to comprehend how a woman could betray her husband in such a calculated and merciless way. The trial unfolded. Brenda's chilling indifference became the focal point. During her testimony, her words were cold and devoid of remorse. "He was a burden I didn't want anymore," she confessed, her eyes flat, her voice unwavering. To her, Rob had become a mere obstacle, one that needed to be eliminated for her to have the life she desired. Her justification was as chilling as it was selfish. She had killed him for money, for control, and for a future that didn't include the man she had once loved. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Family members of Rob sat in the front rows, their grief raw and unrelenting. Austin, Rob's brother, struggled to keep his composure as he looked at Brenda, the woman who had once been family, now the reason for his brother's death. His voice broke as he spoke of Rob's love for his children and the senselessness of the crime. "I never thought I'd be sitting here, watching a woman I trusted tear apart my family," he said, his words heavy with sorrow. The entire courtroom felt the weight of his pain as Brenda sat motionless, unfazed by the devastation she had caused. Brenda Andrew was convicted of first-degree murder, and the sentence was clear: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yet for the family, the conviction felt hollow. No sentence could ever undo the damage she had done, not just to Rob, but to the children who would forever be marked by the tragedy. As the judge's gavel fell, Rob's mother, sitting in the front row, let out a soft, defeated sob. "No punishment is enough," she whispered through her tears, her heart still broken by the loss of her son. The weight of the courtroom's decision felt trivial compared to the agony she would carry for the rest of her life. Brenda, in her cold, calculated manner, showed no emotion as the sentence was handed down. Life in prison was her fate, but her twisted need for control had already destroyed more than Rob's life. It had shattered the lives of her children, who would now grow up without their father, haunted by the loss of the man they loved. The emotional toll on the family was profound. They would never see Rob again. No more birthdays, no more laughter. The grief became a constant companion, one that would never leave them, as they continued to carry the weight of Brenda's actions. What drives a person to betray their own flesh and blood? Was it the love of money, or the thirst for control over a life that no longer suited them? Brenda Andrews' actions were driven by a desperate desire to break free, but in doing so, she condemned herself to a life of emptiness, haunted by the ghost of the man she murdered. In the end, it wasn't just Rob Andrew who died that night. It was the family they had once been, forever torn apart by greed, manipulation, and betrayal. And as Brenda sat in her prison cell, one question lingered. What could have been so broken in her that the love of a family couldn't save her from this darkness?